In today's video, we'll break down the U.S. government shutdown and immigration enforcement efforts, border and airport disruptions, and what a TSA shutdown could mean for travelers. Welcome to iNews Channel, your source for clear, reliable updates from around the world. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an important story. A partial shutdown of the United States federal government is now underway, following a failure by lawmakers in Washington to reach agreement on funding for the Department of Homeland Security. The funding lapse began after Congress did not approve new appropriations before the deadline. As a result, the Department of Homeland Security, commonly referred to as DHS, entered a shutdown, affecting a range of agencies responsible for immigration enforcement, border protection, transportation security, emergency management, and protective services. The political dispute centers on immigration enforcement policy. Democratic lawmakers have stated that they will not support renewed funding for DHS unless new restrictions and oversight measures are placed on federal immigration operations. Their demands intensified following last month's fatal shooting of Alex Priddy and Renee Good in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The incident sparked renewed debate over the conduct, accountability, and operational standards of federal immigration officers. Negotiations between congressional leaders and the executive branch continued throughout the week leading up to the funding deadline. However, those discussions failed to produce a compromise in time to prevent a shutdown. As a result, funding authority for DHS expired, triggering what is known in the United States as a partial government shutdown. To understand the impact, it is important to clarify what a shutdown means in the American system. In the United States, federal agencies require congressional approval to spend money. If lawmakers fail to pass appropriations legislation or a temporary funding measure before existing funding expires, affected agencies must suspend non-essential operations. Employees who are not deemed essential are furloughed, meaning they are temporarily placed on unpaid leave and prohibited from performing their duties. Essential employees, however, must continue working even though they do not receive pay until funding is restored. Unlike previous full-scale shutdowns that affected large portions of the federal government, this shutdown is limited specifically to agencies operating under DHS. The remainder of the federal government remains funded through September 30th, ensuring that most public services continue uninterrupted. Food assistance programs remain operational. Payments to members of the U.S. Armed Forces continue. Most federal civilian employees outside DHS are unaffected. Within DHS, however, the effects are significant. Agencies impacted include those responsible for immigration enforcement, border protection, airport security, disaster response, and protective services for government officials. Immigration enforcement operations are expected to continue largely uninterrupted in the short term. That is because substantial funding for enforcement activities was allocated under a tax and spending law passed in 2025. Those funds remain available and can continue to support deportation and border security efforts even during the shutdown. As a result, while lawmakers debate reforms, operational immigration enforcement activities are unlikely to stop immediately. Democratic lawmakers have proposed a series of reforms tied to new funding. These proposals include establishing a formal code of conduct for immigration officers, requiring clearer identification during enforcement actions, and strengthening oversight mechanisms to address alleged misconduct. Supporters of these measures argue that increased transparency and accountability are necessary to restore public trust. Opponents, primarily Republican lawmakers, argue that such conditions would interfere with enforcement operations and undermine border security. The current impasse reflects broader political divisions over immigration policy in the United States, an issue that has remained deeply contentious for years. Turning to airport security, the situation presents different challenges. At the Transportation Security Administration, approximately 95% of employees are classified as essential. This means that nearly the entire TSA workforce must continue screening passengers and baggage at commercial airports nationwide. However, they are doing so without pay during the shutdown. For many TSA employees, the financial strain of working without a paycheck is not hypothetical. During last year's 43-day shutdown, thousands of airport security officers reported difficulty paying rent, mortgages, and basic living expenses. As that shutdown extended into weeks, absenteeism increased. Some officers called in sick, others took unscheduled leave. Staffing shortages forced certain airports to close security lanes or consolidate checkpoints. Lawmakers now warn that similar patterns could emerge if the current shutdown continues for an extended period. Airport operations depend on maintaining a minimum number of security personnel to process passengers efficiently. If staffing levels drop wait times increase. In severe cases, airports may reduce the number of active checkpoints. While airport screening remains operational at present, the situation is being closely monitored. Beyond aviation security, other components of DHS face operational adjustments. The Secret Service, responsible for protecting senior government officials and foreign dignitaries, continues to function with most personnel designated as essential. Protective missions remain uninterrupted. The Coast Guard continues maritime patrols, search and rescue missions, and law enforcement activities in U.S. waters. Like other essential workers, Coast Guard personnel may experience delayed pay if the shutdown continues. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, faces more immediate administrative challenges. FEMA coordinates federal disaster response and provides financial assistance to states following natural disasters such as hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and earthquakes. During the shutdown, some FEMA employees are furloughed. This limits the agency's ability to process reimbursements to states for disaster-related expenses. While emergency response activities continue, administrative processing may slow. Training programs for emergency responders are also affected. Sessions at federal emergency management training facilities may be postponed or canceled. State and local governments rely on federal reimbursements for recovery efforts. Shutdowns create budgetary strain for smaller jurisdictions with limited reserves. Within DHS, over 90% of the workforce remains on duty as essential during shutdowns. However, furloughs still impact critical administrative, support, and planning functions. Logistics also suffer. Contracting is disrupted, and procurement processes may slow significantly. Moreover, funding uncertainty affects morale. Employees working without pay face significant financial stress. While back pay is historically approved, it isn't immediate. Workers must wait for legislation to pass. Even partial shutdowns can create prolonged disruptions that affect local economies over time. Communities with large DHS workforces may experience reduced consumer spending as employees delay purchases due to uncertainty. Airports experiencing staffing shortages may see declines in passenger throughput, affecting airlines, retailers, and local businesses. The political context surrounding the shutdown remains tense. Congressional leaders from both parties have expressed concern about the potential consequences of extended disruption. However, negotiations remain stalled over the scope and specifics of immigration enforcement reforms. For Democratic lawmakers, the issue is framed around accountability and civil rights protections. For Republican lawmakers, the focus is on maintaining operational flexibility and strong enforcement authority. The executive branch has indicated willingness to continue discussions but has not agreed to all proposed conditions. In Washington, time pressure increases as the shutdown continues. The longer funding remains lapsed, the greater the risk of operational strain and political fallout. For the public, the immediate experience varies depending on location and profession. Travelers passing through airports may notice little difference at first. Flights continue operating. Security checkpoints remain open. However, extended delays in restoring funding could lead to visible changes: longer lines, fewer open lanes, and increased wait times. For federal employees, the impact is more direct. Essential workers must report for duty without knowing when their next paycheck will arrive. Furloughed workers must remain at home, unable to perform their duties or access government systems. Financial institutions sometimes offer short-term assistance programs to federal employees during shutdowns. However, such measures are voluntary and vary by lender. The shutdown also places pressure on lawmakers, particularly as public attention grows. Opinion polls in past shutdowns have shown that voters often assign blame based on perceptions of political responsibility. As a result, both parties face incentives to avoid prolonged stalemate. Historically, most government shutdowns in the United States have ended within days or weeks after negotiations resume under heightened urgency. However, the 43-day shutdown last year demonstrated that extended closures are possible when political divisions are deeply entrenched. For international observers, the situation reflects structural features of the U.S. budget process. Unlike many parliamentary systems, the United States operates under a separation of powers. Congress controls federal spending, while the executive branch implements policy. When the two branches fail to agree on funding legislation, shutdowns can occur. Continuing resolutions, temporary funding measures, are often used to prevent such lapses. In this case, no temporary measure was passed in time. As negotiations continue, lawmakers face choices. They may reach a compromise incorporating partial reforms. They may approve short-term funding to allow further talks. Or they may remain in stalemate, extending the shutdown. For now, the Department of Homeland Security continues operating in a reduced and financially constrained posture. Essential personnel remain at their posts, non-essential operations are paused, and federal workers await resolution. The duration of the shutdown will determine its ultimate impact. A brief shutdown may result in limited disruption. A prolonged one could affect travel, emergency management administration, workforce morale, and broader economic confidence. As discussions proceed in Washington, the situation remains fluid. Attention now turns to whether political leaders can bridge their differences and restore funding, or whether the shutdown will extend further into the coming weeks. For federal employees, for travelers, and for the agencies charged with maintaining security and emergency response across the United States, the outcome carries practical and immediate consequences. Until a funding agreement is reached, the partial shutdown remains in effect. And with each passing day, the urgency to resolve the impasse grows. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back with more updates soon.